I was shocked last week at our joint service when there was a surprise baby shower for me, and I was completely surprised by it. I had no expectation or no thought that that was coming. John was in on it, but somehow he didn't let it slip. And I was so blessed by that. We were so blessed by that and so thankful for all of the gifts to welcome the baby. And it brought to mind for me the old joke that they have about the gifts that were brought to baby Jesus, because we know that the wise men, those who came from the east, brought three types of gifts. What were they? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, people say if they were wise women, what would they have brought? Diapers, wipes, onesies, very practical sorts of things. And they say the women would have asked for directions and not even needed to go to Herod on the way there. They would have just known where to find this child. And we look at these gifts, we say gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We know historically that these gifts are brought to the king. We know that as the wise men bring these as tribute, as they kneel before this Christ child, as they lay these gifts at his feet, and they offer them to Mary and Joseph, what they're doing is symbolizing his reign. And we've also learned over the years that the spices, especially the myrrh and the frankincense, those gave a glimpse of how Jesus was to die. We're going to see that myrrh come back when his body is taken off of the cross as Nicodemus comes at night to prepare him for burial. And so somehow at this moment when the wise men are bringing these gifts, they're kind of painting the picture of what is going to be for all of Jesus's life. And so these gifts seem a little bit less impractical when you think about their symbolism. But this past week, I had the privilege of going down to the Maryland Science Center to see the Mummies of the World exhibit. Did any of you get to see it? How many of you are fascinated by mummies? Yeah, some of you are like, ew, gross. Pastor John didn't want to go. He's like, no, I'm not going. But I had been promising our oldest two children for years that we would go see this exhibit. We'd missed it in Philadelphia. We'd missed it in Charlotte. I wasn't going to fly to Seattle with them just to see it, but I'd made this promise that someday we would see these mummies. And the time finally came. And when I went there, I looked, there are mummies from everywhere. They're not just the ones wrapped up like you expect, but there was in the Egyptian mummy room a little display about the process of mummification. And they had there a little bowl of myrrh. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that gift that the Magi brought to Jesus, how it was so instrumental to the process of mummification. But even more than that, myrrh was very critical to the religious lives of people in Egypt. They used it for all sorts of different purposes. It was actually 5 times more valuable than frankincense. So I guess that wise man was cheaper than the other one, but the one that brought frankincense. But think about this. Where did Jesus and his family have to go after the Magi departed? Egypt. Think about this. You have this carpenter who has left his home in Galilee to go with his young bride who's about to bear a child. They've left what they know to go to be quantified for the census. And while they are there, everything changes in their lives, because when you bring a child into the world, there's upheaval. Everything is different all of a sudden. And so not only did they bring this child into the world in that strange place, in that strange setting, but this child's life was in danger. King Herod wanted him destroyed. He was a threat to the empire. And in fact, all of the children in Bethlehem would face slaughter because of the fact that this Messiah had been born. So what the wise men bring in gold and frankincense and myrrh is not simply a gift to an infant king. What they have brought to Mary and Joseph is a way out. Because these people can take this gift, they can go along those trade routes, the Silk Road and the Spice Road, where throughout the Roman Empire and all over the East, people were traveling back and forth along these trade routes, carrying with them products, goods, spices, herbs, all sorts of materials, ideas. And this carpenter and his wife and their little child who they were trying to protect as they were heading to Egypt could fly under the radar inconspicuously with their gold, their frankincense, and their myrrh. It was their salvation to have these gifts that were going to help them to live in exile for as long as they needed to keep this Christ child safe before he was able to go back to Nazareth in Galilee. So many times when we receive gifts, when we look at their value and look at what they are, we may think that they're symbolic. We may think that there is something that, is just something nice to look at. But the truth is, when you examine it more, so often the gifts that we receive are useful in ways that we could never expect. Because that's how God works. God works through ways that we don't expect him to. Surprising ways, sometimes seemingly impractical ways. But then when we have the chance to step back and look at the grand scheme of our lives in this world, we can recognize that God takes these difficulties and these purposes and somehow weaves them together into his great plan, not only for our lives, but for all of creation. I was thinking about this around the dinner table this week with my son Asher. We were laughing about a couple of years ago how I had been playing baseball with him in the backyard. And I thought I was throwing the best. I thought it was a strike right down the middle. I'd wound up. I was bringing it at him, the heat. I thought there's no way this kid's going to get this. But instead, he nails the ball and smacks me right in the head with it. Thanks be to God, it was a tennis ball, not like a real baseball. And a couple of days after that, I just felt like I had this fog in my head. That's the only way I could describe it. And I'm not a very good patient going to the doctor. I usually just use WebMD and Google stuff. If I think I can treat it myself over the counter, I do. But this time I said, I think I need to go see the doctor. And I went in there, and after he talked to me, he said, we're going to order a test just to make sure everything's okay with your head, but I'm pretty sure there's no concussion. I think you're fine. But he said, now what does concern me is the spot right there on your wrist. How long has that been there? It's like, I don't know. I don't really pay any attention to it. He said, I want to take that spot. I want to take it right now. It turns out that little spot on my wrist that I ignored was melanoma, the deadliest type of cancer for people my age, statistically. And I just ignored it. And luckily, because I'd gone in there for my head injury, the doctor found something that was much more dangerous to me. And I was laughing about that with Asher. I said, I was inconvenienced. I was bothered by having to go to the doctor. But that was a blessing. It was a gift to me that you hit me in the head. He said, yeah, I kind of saved your life, didn't I? As any 9-year-old would. He'd taken full credit for it. But I said, yeah, really. It was a gift for me to get hit in the head. Now, who would ever say that? But somehow God used that moment to point to something that seemed much smaller in my life at the time, but in fact was the real danger that I had no idea of. And that's how gifts of God work. Sometimes they come as gold and frankincense and myrrh. They look like they're valuable. They look like they have something to them. But sometimes the gift that God gives us is an inconvenience or an illness or something that we don't think is of any use or any value. But for some reason, the glory of God is being worked out through that. That somehow the plan and the purpose that God has for all of us and all of creation is taking place in a way that we don't expect. We call that in our life of faith prevenient grace. That means it's the gift of God that's at work in our lives even before we're aware of it. We don't even have names for it sometimes, and we might not even notice it. But then as we get more removed from the situation, as we look backward, we can say, that is the moment that God was saving me from this. And I had no idea at the time that was the moment that God had given me something precious for my life. And I had no idea. When we come together to celebrate the Epiphany, we're looking at how God reveals God's self in amazing ways, through stars and through light and through a Christ child born in a manger. But that same epiphany takes place throughout our lives when God reveals God's self to us, where we didn't see it happening at first, but we look back and we have those moments where we say, aha, that is where God was. That is how God protected me. That's how I felt like I was in exile. I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere with no hope, but somehow God was bringing me out of a dangerous situation and providing for me along the way. That is the gift of Epiphany. That's the gift that we celebrate today when we look upon this Christ child in the manger and we think about these wise men bringing these gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. But the truth is that God is bringing to each of us gifts equally as valuable, seemingly as strange from time to time, but in all of it, that God, through His mercy, through His grace, is giving us this gift of life and redemption and promise. And we celebrate that this day and all days. Thanks be to God, the giver of every good and perfect gift. Amen.